Okay, thank you to everybody for tuning in. We are continuing our set of shiurim on the Amidah. Last week we took a break to study the origin of the keynotes for Tisha B'Av. I should say 2 weeks ago. And where we left off before Tisha B'Av was the Beracha of Kibbutz Galiot. We spoke about how that was the first of the collective Berachot of Shmona Esrei. And the history that we explored in the Beracha of Kibbutz Galiot was how that inspired, or I should say, was the first inspiration for the reforming or progressive Jews to make a change to the tefillah in the modern era. This week, we are going to stay pretty far away from the modern era, and we're going to discuss Bracha number 11, Beracha of Mishpat. Now, this bracha doesn't really have an official name. The Gemara almost never gives it a real name. Most people will simply call it Din or Mishpat. That was the colloquial name given for this bracha. In today's parlance, most people will call it something like that, or they'll say Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat to refer to this bracha. And the language of this bracha, just like the language of many brachot, is based on Pesukim. It is impossible to be biblically tone deaf and to get through the tefillah or to study the tefillah, because so many of the brachot that were instituted by Chazal were built on Pesukim from Tanakh. This one is no exception. This bracha of Hashiva Shavtenu Kvarishona Yotzenu Kvatchila comes from the pasuk in Yeshaya. This is Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amos, the first parak in Yeshayahu, in his very grim reprimand of Klal Yisrael. Yeshayahu threatens Klal Yisrael that Hashem cares not for their sacrifices. What Hashem wants is morality. What Hashem wants is for people to treat one another with dignity. And it is only if people can treat each other with dignity and morality that Hashem will bring them back from the ruins of Yerushalayim. And at the very end of the parak, he speaks a few pesukim of Nechama. One of those pesukim is this: Ve'ashiva shoftayach kivarishonan, I shall return your magistrates of old, your old judges, v'yoatzayach kivatechilan, your counselors of yore. After that, you should be called the city of righteousness and the faithful city. Sion b'mishpat tipadeh, v'shaveh b'tzedakah. And that can mean two things. It's poetic. Sion is going to be redeemed either with justice or from the zechut, the merit of justice. V'shaveh and its captives will be redeemed with righteousness. These are some of the most beautiful pesukim in Tanakh, and it's typical of the Nevuot of Yeshaya. Now, when we take a glance at this bracha, you open a siddur, your first reaction to a person's first assumption when they look at this bracha is that the bracha is talking about the Messianic era. Please return our judges as of the days of yore. It would sound like this bracha has a messianic context. Just like the pasuk in Yeshaya, so too does this bracha hope for the Mashiach. It's about national redemption, national restoration, having a utopian rule of Jewish people on the Holy Land. That's the overall gist of it. And if you look at the structure of Shemona Esrei, the overall structure also lends to this understanding. And we've looked at the structure of Shemona Esrei a few times, and there's multiple different ways to interpret the structure of Shemona Esrei. One could say that the first 6 middle brachot are personal petitions, and the last 6 are collective petitions for the whole Klal Yisrael. And one could say, could be even more nuanced. One could say that, well, the first 6 are personal, but they're divided into spiritual and physical. And the second 6 are indeed collective, but some of them have to do with national rebuilding, and some have to do with the realization of that rebuilding. So, or even past and present. So no matter what system you follow, this bracha, Mishpat number 11, is going to be in one of these categories. It's going to be collective, it's going to be about the national rebuilding, and it's going to have an emphasis on the future. If you follow the idea that the entire bracha has one, the entire Shemay Esrei has one rhetorical message or rhetorical argument, one could say that part of the argument is that it is possible for Klal Yisrael to have a geula. Now, that's really nice. Some people also understand this bracha to be a petition for in our own time, not just in the time of Mashiach, but it's also a petition in our own time to have justice and to find justice. Not, I don't believe it's particularly social justice. I think it also means legislative justice and in particular justice in the court systems, but there is an element of social justice to it as well. More importantly, however, this simplistic understanding of what this bracha is talking about still leaves a lot of questions. Because why put this bracha in the Shemay Esrei? Why was it so important that a bracha for justice should be in the Shemay Esrei? A bracha about the judges of yore. When did it come here? Was it put into the Shemay Esrei directly after the Churban? Was this bracha? Is this bracha the symptom or the what's it called? The result of persecutions, or is it simply Chazal looking back at the Churban and saying, you know what, politics and terrible leadership were the reason for the Churban? If one is going to look at this bracha historically, it does pose a lot of questions. How in the world did it get into the Shemay Esrei? And if one believes that the Anshe Knesset Hagdola or Rabbi Gamliel composed this bracha, its exact reasoning is a little bit mysterious, because yes, we're talking about national rebuilding, but of all the aspects of national rebuilding, why speak about the court system? Like, why would you? Is it merely speaking about the ruling system? Is it anti-monarchy? Like, what exactly is the theology behind this bracha is a little bit mysterious. But even more mysterious than the theology and the ancient history of this bracha, which I don't think we'll ever be able to unravel, is the Gemaras which speak about the bracha, which sound like the bracha isn't talking about Mishpat to begin with. And all of the versions that we have today, all of the versions of Ashiva Shoftenu that we're aware of, very much sound like they are brachos for a utopian justice. They are brachos pleading to Hashem to restore justice to the earth. But if you look at the Gemaras, they have painted a different picture. Let's look at the Gemara in Megillah Daf Yud Zayin Beis. The Gemara says, "Umaro lomar kibbutz galios lachar berachas hashanim." Why did we put Tekah b'shofar after the bracha parnasa? Because the pasuk says, "Ve'atem harei Yisrael an pechem titein perichem tisu lami Yisrael ki kervu lavo." V'kivan sheneska b'tzu galios. And okay, so why do we put shaftim after kibbutz galios? Because this is the order of events. After the kibbutz galios, nasa din b'rasham, there will be what's the word? Judgment, so to speak, meted out to the evildoers. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, "Ve'ashiva yadi alayich ve'etzreif kabar sigayich." The pasuk right before in Yeshaya says that I shall turn my hand towards you and wipe away the dross of with lie. Essentially, like I'm going to wash out and clean out all the impurities among you. Uchsiv, and then right after the pasuk says, "Uchsiv ashiva shiftach v'reshena v'yatzach kivatchila." So that sounds like after Hashem is going to deal with, what do you call it? After Hashem is going to bring back the geula, which is the pasukim before in Yeshaya, Hashem is going to bring justice to the earth, and that's called Nasa Din Bereshayim. That is perplexing, because none of the nuschais that we have say anything about din b'rashayim. The bracha is not about evildoers. If anything, the bracha of lameshumadim or laminim over time developed a theology of evildoers. But this bracha, well, we don't have anything about evildoers in this bracha. It's a very bizarre thing to say that the bracha is about evil. And another Gemara in brachas Daf Chav Tes Amud Aleph says something very similar. The bracha, the shortened bracha of Shemon Esrei is called Havinenu. And in Havinenu, we see a little bit, a remnant of some of the girsais that they had in their time in the time of the Amoraim. And let's see what it says here. Unifutzotenu me'arba tikabetz, right? A shortened version of kibbutz galios, the bracha before it. What are the next words? Vehatoim al datecha yishpetu. and those who stray on against your wisdom shall be judged. Very bizarre. So there's two ways of learning this Gemara. Rashi brings two ways. Either v'hatoim, those who don't know how to judge properly, al da'atecha yishpetu, should judge properly, right? They should judge al pidin. It's a prayer for the judges, which would be much more sensible. Or Rashi says, and this is the more that's how the Bahag says it, but or more troubling, you could say v'hatoim, and those who sin, al da'atecha yishpetu, should be judged according to your wisdom. Which again, if that does refer to evildoers, is very perplexing because our Gersais have nothing to do with that. So what is the Gemara talking about? Uri Erlich himself has his own chiddush. She says this could be in the vein of redemption. One could say that the entire Shemoneh Esrei is talking about the promise of Geula, and v'hatoim means the entire Klal Yisrael. Those who strayed away, meaning those nifutzotenu, those people who were wandering away from the land, al da'atecha yishpetu, in a messianic utopian era, should only be ruled by your wisdom. Another fascinating way to interpret this. But as far as we know, the Gersais, the dominant Gersais, just don't have anything about this. So there is actually, I lied a little bit, there were actually two nuschaot, two very old nuschaot, which remained, which had a remnant of this. If you look, this is the Nusach Romaniot, the Nusach of the Greek Jews, and the old version of the Persian Jews had the same. At the end of the Bracha of Shiva Shoftenu, it says, let me just read it to you. Shiva Shoftenu kvarishona, v'yotzenu kivat techila, v'timloch aleinu ata levadecha bechesed v'rachmim v'tzadikeinu b'mishpat. In the Romaniot version, the last words are ve'alna tarshienu badin, and do not allow us to be judged to be guilty, which might be a remnant of a much more ancient version in the time of the Amoraim or the Tanaim. But as far as the Geniza evidence is concerned, from what they found in the Cairo Geniza, we just don't have anything or any nusach of the bracha that looks like the main topic is Risha'im. So it is possible that the original nusach was completely different, and it just completely lost to the Geniza. And if you would say that, that means that because the Geniza documents come from like at the very earliest, the 700s, and potentially the 800s, there's just a gap. There's a 400-year gap between the time of the Amoraim and the Geniza. So what you find in the Geniza simply isn't reflective of what was happening in the time of the Amoraim. Lastly, I should just mention that V'haser Mimenu Yagon V'anacha is also very curious, because that seems to discuss a general oppression, general sigh and anxiety, and we don't really know where that girsa came from. So let's look at the Geniza manuscripts together, and if you're following with the video, you can look here at this table. From the Geniza evidence, the overwhelming amount of manuscripts are very simple. They have 42 versions in the Minhag Bavli, are very simple. It'll say Hashiva Shoftenu Kvarishon V'Yotzenu Kvatchila Baruch Ata Hashem Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. Or in the Eretz Yisrael version, their chatima, their end of the bracha was not Baruch Ata Hashem Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. Their bracha was Baruch Ata Hashem Ohev HaMishpat. Much more simple. Many manuscripts that are reflective of Eretz Yisrael and of the Minhag Bavel attest to this early nusach, and it's quite likely that this was the original pristine nusach that was developed in the time of the Amoraim and the Tanaim. If it wasn't for the Gemara, two Gemaras that say something different, we would really suspect that there was that this was the earliest version. One could learn up the Gemara in a different way, but it is suspicious. Regardless, this seems to be the earliest form of the bracha, simply a paraphrase of the pasuk in Yeshaya. Now, usually the chatima of the bracha of Shemoneh Esrei all of the chatimot, all of what's called the eulogies, all of the eulogies of the brachot of Shemoneh Esrei historically have been the most stable part. Essentially, what the eulogy says, what the chasima says, is very often the central message. and the eulogies have been the most stable girsaot or nusraot, and they're the most similar among all the rites. However, this chatima, by this particular bracha, has a very strange form of instability. This is not an instability caused by medieval manuscripts. This is an instability caused by confusion in the sources from Chazal and confusion in sources from the Rishonim. Unlike typical medieval manuscripts of Sidurim, which can cause some instability in a Nusach, this is not medieval Sidur manuscripts that cause this problem. This is Nuschaot in the Gemara that cause this problem. We're going to look at the Gemara together. This is a very famous Gemara in, what's it called? Yeah, this is a very famous Gemara in Brachot. First of all, before we go further and look at the Gemara, you should realize that this Chatima, whether it's the version of Eretz Yisrael or the version of the Bavli, is based on a pasuk. The pasuk in Tilim, or the pasuk in Tilim Lamed Zayin, or the pasuk in Tilim Lamed Gimel. The pasuk in Lamed Zayin says, "Ki Hashem ohev mishpat v'lo yazov et chasidav." Right, that's around Tzadikim b'Hashem. And then we say, "Ohev tzedakah mishpat chesed Hashem malah haaretz." These two versions, these two expressions, come directly from the pasukim in Tilim. So that's where they come from. But let's look at the Gemara together. It's a very famous Gemara in Brachot, Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet. Says the bracha about this, the end of this, about the Gemara says about the end of this bracha, a very famous halacha that we all know about, Aseres Yemei Tshuva. V'yamar Rabba bar China da Saba mishmei derab. Kol hashana kula adam espalaha kel hakadosh melech ohev tzedakah mishpat chutz ma'aser yam shebein Rosh Hashanah yom Kippurim shemaspalo hamelech hakadosh v'hamelech hamishpat. All year long, what do we say? We say Hakel HaKadosh, and we say Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat, right? Those are the nuschais we're familiar with. Except for Aseres Yemei Tshuva, that's where we say HaMelech HaKadosh and HaMelech HaMishpat. Says Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Elazar says, that was Rav. Rabbi Elazar says, Ilu Amar Hakel HaKadosh Yatza. B'diavad, a person could say Hakel HaKadosh. Right? That's a b'diavad, meaning l'chatchila he agrees with Rav that one should say Hamelech HaKadosh and he should say Hamelech HaMishpat. But b'diavad, he could say Hakel HaKadosh. He doesn't say anything about Hakel HaMishpat, Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. He just says by Hakel HaKadosh b'diavad Yer Yotze. Why? Because it's from a pasuk shenemar V'yigba Hashem Tzevakos b'Mishpat v'Hakel HaKadosh nikdash b'Tzedakah emasai v'yigba Hashem Tzevakos b'Mishpat elu asar yom shem b'Rosh Hashanah v'ad Yom Kippurim v'Kamar Hakel HaKadosh. Right, so we see that when is Hashem sitting in Mishpat, those are the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, and still the pasuk says Hakel HaKadosh. My Habe'Allah, the Gemara says, well, whatever happened about this dispute? Amar Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef says, Hakel HaKadosh u'melech ohev tzedakah mishpat, right, that you should say that during the Aseres Yemei Tshuva. Rabba Amar Rabba says, Hamelech HaKadosh u'melech HaMishpat, that you should do like Rav said, and you should say Hamelech HaKadosh and Hamelech HaMishpat. V'hilchos like Rabba, and Allah is like Rabba, and that's what we do. Now, nobody really seems to explain in the Gemara where, when, or why this minhag began. Nobody says, oh, by the way, we started this minhag because of XYZ reason, or when exactly it started. Rav is the first one to bring this up. It's never brought in a Mishnah, but this is the Gemara we have. The central problem with this Gemara, and this is a glaring problem which all of the Rishonim approach, is what's the difference between a Melech HaMishpat and Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat? They both say Melech. What exactly is the difference between saying Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat and Melech HaMishpat? They're both calling Hashem King of the world. The second problem, the lesser problem with this Gemara, is the grammar. HaMelech HaKadosh grammatically in Hebrew makes sense. HaMelech HaMishpat grammatically in Hebrew does not make sense. In Hebrew, in Lashon HaKodesh, you would say Melech HaMishpat, not HaMelech HaMishpat. So Rashi here on the page says, well, you could support this with a couple of psukim. In Lashon HaKodesh, in the older, way of writing Hebrew, there are exceptions, right? It says, what's it called? Ha'aron HaBerit. It says Ha'emek HaPigarim. And other grammarians like Yosef ibn Shanach also bring this as a proof that it was possible in older versions of Hebrew, in Lashon HaKodesh in particular, to have HaMelech HaMishpat, and that it's not grammatically incorrect. However, Rashi in a tshuva says, and this is brought in Machzor Vitri, it's brought in Tshuvat Rashi. Rashi says, personally, though, I think it's a mistake. He said, I think just the Chazanim mistakenly added a hey, just like they said Hakel HaKadosh. Honestly, I think it's a mistake. The Chazanim really should be saying Baruch Atah Hashem Melech HaMishpat, but because they said HaMelech HaKadosh, they also said HaMelech HaMishpat, and it's stuck. But I don't want to change things. I'm not going to change the nusach of Tefillah, says Rashi. And besides, we also have these Pesukim. That's the opinion of Rashi. But when you look at this Gemara and you see the discrepancy, you're like, wait, Melech Mishpat, and then you say HaMelech Mishpat. One's first question would be, well, maybe there's another version of the Gemara. And in truth is, there's many other versions of this Gemara. One of the most important is the version of Pirkei ben Bavoy. Pirkei ben Bavoy was a person of a somewhat famous teshuvah written in the time of the Geonim. You see, in the roughly around the 800s and the 900s, there was competition between the yeshivot of Bavel and the yeshivot of Eretz Yisrael. The Gaonic yeshivas in Bavel were battling successfully for supremacy over the yeshivot of Eretz Yisrael, and they had a couple of polemics regarding the proper halachot and proper nuschot of tefillah. One of those polemics is a teshuvah from a person who calls himself Pirkei ben Bavoy. We don't know if that's a pen name, if that's his real name. All we can gather is that he was a Talmud of Rabbi Yehudai Gaon, which would place him sometime in the 800s. So he writes this letter to people in Eretz Yisrael, and it's a whole long diatribe about all the things they're doing wrong about tefillah and all the different minhagim that they're doing that are incorrect and how they should follow the Talmud Bavli and all the minhagim of Rabbi Yehudai Gaon. And it's fascinating because from it, we infer a whole lot of things about the history of the time. It's a very important document. So in there, he brings the Susach of the Gemara, but he completely omits Rabbi Elazar. So essentially, just has the first part, the part about Rav, where it says that a person should say HaMelech HaKadosh and HaMelech HaMishpat. And then at the very end, where we had Rabba and Rav Yosef, the machlokes between Rabba and Yosef about whether or not we should do HaMelech HaMishpat and HaMelech HaKadosh, or if one could say HaKel HaKadosh and Ohev Tzedakah HaMishpat. Instead, he has a grammatical argument. He says, look how pedantic the Rabbanim are, how concerned they are with every single letter, because Rabba and Rav Yosef here have a machlokes about whether or not you say Melech HaKadosh and Melech HaMishpat, or HaMelech HaKadosh and HaMelech HaMishpat. That was the version of the Gemara that Pirkei ben Bavoy had in the 800s, which is so interesting that you would find, and at least he believed that two Amoraim were arguing over the grammar of the Chatima of this bracha. That's an interesting curiosity. No Rabbi Elazar, just the memra of Rav, and a machlokus in the Gemara about grammar. A very curious version. But the majority version, the majority of manuscripts of the Talmud that we have that are not based on that are not the Vilna. The Vilna based itself on one or two manuscripts. But what we have, most of the manuscripts of the majority of the manuscripts of the Gemara do not say Kolash Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. Rather, they say Hakel HaMishpat. That all year round a person should say Hakel HaKadosh and Hakel HaMishpat. Yet on Aseret Yimei Tshuva and Rosh Hashanah, a person should say HaMelech HaKadosh and HaMelech HaMishpat. This is the majority version. Many Rishonim have it this way. The Rif has it this way. And in these versions, in many of these versions, Rabbi Elazar doesn't just argue by Hakel HaKadosh. He also argues by Hakel HaMishpat. He says you could say Hakel HaKadosh and Hakel HaMishpat, and you're also Yotzei. No matter what, you're Yotzei. I'll just go on a halachic tangent for a second. Because the Vilna version and the version that was most known says that it has Rabbi Elazar as only arguing on Hakel HaKadosh. A lot of poskim believe that even b'diavad, if you said Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat, and you instead of saying HaMelech HaMishpat, you would have to go back because even b'diavad you're still not Yotzei. However, the Ramah says, well, there's other shitas that say, that Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat is also saying Melech, and it's fine. So Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. The Ramah allows you to continue because he doesn't want you to repeat the entire Shemona Esrei. But this machlekes in the Paiskim about whether or not you have to go back is based on the gersais of this Gemara. Is it Hakel HaMishpat or is it Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat? And I just want you to entertain in your mind for a second how strange that would be if two things were true. First of all, the bracha was talking about din for Rishayim, and second of all, the chasima was Hakel HaMishpat. That would have been a very different bracha than the versions that we saw in the Geniza. And that would mean that the brachas that we have in the Geniza would be completely unreflective of the bracha that they said in the time of the Amoraim. It's possible. I'm not saying it's likely, but it is possible that there was a very different bracha in the time of the Amoraim. And I'll just point here to look at the manuscript here. If you're looking at my screen, this is the Munich manuscript of the Talmud, V'hakel HaMishpat. You see, it says Hakel HaKadosh, V'hakel HaMishpat. I hope the camera could pick up where my mouse is pointing. Okay. This version, however, of Hakel HaMishpat was never found in a siddur ever. Essentially, in any siddur which somebody prayed from, whether it was a manuscript in the Karageniza, whether it was a medieval manuscript from the time of the Rishonim, never ever in the history of ever have we ever found a siddur which had, for a person's personal use, where he ended the bracha with Baruch Atah Hashem Hakel HaMishpat, which essentially casts a lot of doubt on this version of the Gemara. How could this Gemara be correct? Well, let's look at this tshuva from the Rimagash. The Rimagash was one of the early Rishonim. He was a titan among the Rishonim. Essentially, the history of him was that he was born in Spain, in Seville or Granada, and he went at a very young age to learn in the yeshiva of the Rif in Lucena. The Rif was already very old at the time, and I believe the Rimagash was born in around 1077. The Rif died in roughly 1103, I think. And when the Rif died, instead of appointing his son as the Reish Yeshiva in Lucena, he appointed the Rimagash, who was only like 26 years old at the time. He appointed the Rimagash to be the Reish Yeshiva of the entire, what is one of the most illustrious yeshivas in Spain. And the Rishonim always treat the Rimagash with a tremendous reverence, especially the Rambam, who was a spiritual disciple of the Rimagash, since his father learned by him. His father learned in, Rabbi Maimon learned in Lucena. So let's look at this tshuva. The Shesha Alta, he was asked the question, Im mutar lomar, is it permitted to say in the rest of the days of the year, Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat? Or is it not mutar to say Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat? Does a person have to say Hakel HaMishpat or Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat? Essentially, listen to the premise of this question. The people who are asking him are saying, are you even allowed to say Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat? What we know is that a person should say either Hakel HaMishpat or Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. What does that mean that the people asking? What does that mean? That means that the people asking him are only aware of two girsas. They're aware of Hakel HaMishpat and they're aware of Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. So what's going on? Is that something they saw in their Sidurim? That's possible, but more likely it's saying that this is something they saw in their versions of the Gemara. That these Shoalim had two manuscripts in their yeshiva, wherever they were from. They're like, Rabbi, in our yeshiva, we have two manuscripts. We have one manuscript of the Talmud that says Hakel HaMishpat, and the other one says Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. Why do people even say Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat? As an outside observer, that's how I understand the question. But one could look into this, into the question a different way. You could say maybe they actually had it in their siddur. We just never found a siddur that looked like that. Okay, what does he answer to them? He says, the reason why we don't say Melech Ohev, the reason why we don't say HaMelech HaMishpat in the rest of the year, so because Hashem is not sitting on the Kisei Din. However, during the Aseret Simei Tshuva, Hashem is sitting on the Kisei Din, right? It says, we want to demonstrate that Hashem is more lofty in those days, and he's Yoshev al Kisei Din v'dan kol echad kifi ma'asav. And therefore, Ra'ui lomar b'yamim haniskrim HaMelech HaMishpat. Aval lo manu lomar, but they didn't prevent us from saying Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat b'shari mot hashana. Why? She'en b'chlal lashon zeh v'lo nireh mimenu shu yoshev al kisei mishpat v'dan kol habriot b'oto ha'et. Meaning, he's saying there's a very fine distinction. Yes, you could say the gersa of the Gemara is Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. You could say that in the Vilna. The Vilna is right. The Vilna Shas is right. All year long, say Hakel HaKadosh and Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. But on Yamim Neraim, you say HaMelech HaMishpat. What's the difference? They both say Melech. The difference is that HaMelech HaMishpat sounds like Hashem is actively sitting and judging people, while Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat is just a attribution of Hashem. It's a way of describing Hashem. It doesn't actually say, it doesn't sound like Hashem is sitting on his Kisei of Mishpat. Well, Mashener Mimenu, in my personal opinion, Shu Ohev Mishpat Klomer Maskim Bo Ve'eno to Mimenu. I'm sorry, I misread that. But okay. Essentially, he says that what it seems in the Beracha of Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat is a passive way of describing Hashem. Okay. So Rimigash approves of the Girsa of Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. That's a valid way of saying the bracha. But he's also aware of two other Girsos: Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat without the word Melech, and a Girsa which had Hakela Mishpat. Three Gersais he's aware of in the Gemara. Fascinating. The Rambam, his spiritual disciple, goes back and forth. If you look at the Rambam in Mishnah Torah and you look at the Rambam in Siddur and you look at the Rambam in Chuvas, the Rambam goes back and forth. There's even a version in the manuscript of Yad HaChazaka, and this is in Hilchos Tefillah, I think it's Yud Ches. The Rambam says in one of those places, the person says all year, Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat, and in one of the manuscripts, somebody crossed out the word Melech. Could have been the Rambam who crossed it out. But in one of those manuscripts, the word Melech is crossed out, like it's a correction. And in his Teshuvot, the Rambam was asked about this. He was asked about which one is correct. Should we say Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat or Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat? And he said, I prefer Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat because it leaves out the Melech and it solves the problem of the Gemara. It solves the whole central problem that there's no difference. I prefer Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. That's what the Rambam says. But he went back and forth as far as we can tell. Now, whatever became of this? So, to summarize, there's this rift between people who are Talmudists, right? Those who study Gemara, and those who study Geniza manuscripts. Everyone who studies the Gemara believes that the Hakel HaMishpat was the original Girsa of the Gemara. Most of the people who study the Gemara, the manuscripts of the Talmud, they look at it and they say, you know what? I think that the majority version of the manuscripts of Gemara say Hakel HaMishpat. Some of them say Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. So we believe that it's most likely that in the time of the Amoraim, the version was Hakel HaMishpat. Possibly they said Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat, but most likely the original bracha was Hakel HaMishpat. Over time, it was changed. People said like the Eretz Yisrael version. The Eretz Yisrael version was Ohev Mishpat, and then the Bavli adopted the Eretz Yisrael version and expanded it and called it Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. That's what happened to the Chasima. That's how the Talmud scholars look at it. The Geniza scholars look at it, and they, especially Uri Erlich, he looks at it and he says, no, I mean, look how many manuscripts we have in the Geniza. We have almost 100 manuscripts in the Geniza. None of them say Hakel HaMishpat. So how could you say that Hakel HaMishpat is original? It must be that what happened is that the copyists of the Gemara looked at the Gemara and said, this makes no sense. How could the Gemara say that all year long you say Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat, and then on Aseres Yemei Tshuva you say Baruch Hashem Melech HaMishpat? It must be the copyists who changed the Gemara in the time of the Gaonim, and they changed it from Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat, and they wrote in Hakel HaMishpat in order to solve this central difficulty, this central problem with the Gemara. So there's no end to the complexity of this sugya. And to get even more interesting, I was very specific when I said there are no versions of a siddur which ever say Baruch Atah Hashem Hakel HaMishpat. However, there are two external sources which are not from the siddur. Besides the Gemara, there's two other sources which do say Hakel HaMishpat. One source is a medrash. There's a medrash which I didn't have time to find before the shiur. I think it's a medrash about Shmona Esrei, where the medrash, its version of Shmona Esrei says Baruch Atah Hashem Hakel HaMishpat. But there's also a tshuva from the Gaonim. This is a tshuva from Rav Tzemach Gaon, and this is in Ginzei Kedem Gimel. There's a tshuva from Rav Tzemach Gaon, where he mentions a version of Shmona Esrei, like a shortened Havinenu, which was done for Mincha Erev Shabbos. And he says, this is what the Chazanim did for Mincha Erev Shabbos. This is our Havinenu type thing. And this was our poetic version of Shmona Esrei for Erev Shabbos. And in one of those versions of that Teshuvah, it says, Baruch Atah Hashem Hakel HaMishpat. Now, just for funsies, I'll add one last enormous complexity to this, and I apologize in advance because this is, if you're listening and your head hurts already, we're just going to make it even worse. Let me show you the Gemara in the Yerushalmi, because let's just recap for a second. We had Rav who said that a person has to say Hamelach HaKadosh and Hamelach HaMishpat on the Seres Yemei Tshuva. We had Rabbi Lazar who said the opposite. A person could say Hakel HaKadosh and Hakel HaMishpat, right? Look at the Gemara in Yerushalmi. The Gemara in Yerushalmi in Rosh Hashanah says that there's a special bracha called Adir HaMelucha, which is completely extinct. There's a bracha that was said by the Minhag of Eretz Yisrael on Rosh Hashanah called Adir HaMelucha. This was used as the fourth bracha of Rosh Hashanah. We found it in the Geniza, and this was the Minhag of Eretz Yisrael. The fourth bracha on Rosh Hashanah, the Gemara of the bracha of Shofars, I think, would be Adir. Malchios. Malchios would be Adir HaMelucha. That was their version. Now, some people followed Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and instead of making the fourth bracha, the bracha about Malchus, they made the third bracha, Hakel HaKadosh, the bracha about Malchus. Following? Okay. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Abo b'shem Rabbi Lazar, B'kol makom avar b'hiskir Adir HaMelucha lo yatsa. If a person ever replaces Hakel HaKadosh, and instead of saying Hakel HaKadosh, he says Baruch Ata Hashem Adir HaMelucha, he's not Yotzei. Chutz min Hakel HaKadosh shel Rosh Hashanah u'belvad b'musaf. The only time the third bracha Shemon Esrei is allowed to end with Baruch Ata Hashem Adir HaMelucha is if a person did that for Rosh Hashanah by Musaf. That's the only time you're allowed to say Baruch Ata Hashem Adir HaMelucha. In other words, he's countering a minhag that was existent in Eretz Yisrael at the time, that some people, instead of saying Baruch Ata Hashem Hakel HaKadosh, they would say Baruch Ata Hashem Adir HaMelucha. And the argument is this bracha is about Kedusha, it's not about Malchus, so get that nusach out of here. But on Rosh Hashanah, you could say Baruch Ata Hashem Adir HaMelucha on Rosh Hashanah. Ve'asya Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. What does that tell you? That tells you that Rabbi Lazar is the one who's permitting on Rosh Hashanah a person to say something akin to Hamelach HaKadosh. But if you look at the next paragraph of the Gemara, we have a memra in the name of Rav who argues on this. Beracha B'Zur Rachanin Bar B'Shem Bobo B'Shem Rav says, Sarich Lomar Hakel HaKadosh. No, a person has to say on Rosh Hashanah, Baruch Ata Hashem Hakel HaKadosh. The exact opposite of Rav in the Bavli. This is a brain bender, and this Gemara throws a wrench into the whole plans. Now, it depends on, we've gone through enough complexity already, but the gist of how one comes out when one looks at these two sugyos is which one you believe has primacy. If you believe that the Nusach Bavli, the Gemara in Bavli, more often has more correct versions of Braisais, then you trust the Bavli. If you trust the Yerushalmi more, and you say the Yerushalmi has the more correct versions of the Braises and the Memras, then you're going to rebuild everything in the whole history based on the Yerushalmi. But Rav was from Eretz Yisrael. So what happened? You're going to tell me that in Eretz Yisrael, they had the wrong version of, what Rav said? It just doesn't make any sense. So it's a very bizarre thing. So there's been numerous reconstructions of how to develop this history. There's numerous different opinions. The short answer is we don't know. There have even been some very interesting attempts. Uziel Fuchs tried to prove that Hamelach HaKadosh was used year-round. He didn't have any proof that Hamelach HaMishpat was used year-round, but he believes that, well, year-round Jewish people in ancient times used to say either Hakel HaKadosh or Hamelach HaKadosh. And what ended up happening was that they decided on a split. And year-round they would say Hakel HaKadosh, and Seres Yemei Tshuva they would say Hamelach HaKadosh. But before that, it was interchangeable. Interesting. Very interesting hypothesis. And Yosef Heinemann seems to say this as well. But we don't know the same thing about Hamelach HaMishpat and Hakel HaMishpat or Ohev Tzedakah HaMishpat. The truth is, a lot of this history is completely lost, and the ancient material is really ancient. And if there's a lesson that we're going to walk away from in this shiur, the lesson of how to approach the study of tefillah is that when you are dealing with a material source, with a source material, you have to take the source in the context of its date and of its geography before you reach any conclusion. Yes, you could look at the corpus of Geniza evidence, and you could say, what? Look, I have 75 manuscripts from the Geniza. None of them say anything about Baruch Hashem Hakel Mishpat. I never found a siddur that says Baruch Hashem Hakel Mishpat, and I almost never found a siddur that says anything about Rishayim. Yet, when you look in other places that are not geographically in Egypt. Like if you take the Greek version, you have Ve'alna Tarshienu Bedin. If you look at the manuscripts of the Gemara that are not from the East, that are not from the Kargeniz, and they're not in Egypt, you find Brachos Baruch Hashem Hakel HaMishpat. You must take the geography into account, and you must take the date into the account, because we know that the earliest Geniza documents are from the late 700s, mid 800s. That means that there's a few hundred years in between the time of the Gemara and the Cairo Geniza, and a few hundred years is a very long time. You can't just look back at say, well, 400, 800, what's the difference? That's a very long time. So you need to realize when you're looking at the evidence from the Geniza that not always does a single source material give you all the answers. You need to understand it in its context, in its date, in its geography, and look to other geographies, look to other dates, and look to the context of who, what, why, and when we're saying those tefillas, in particular the Ben Ezra community in Fustat, and you'll get a better understanding of whether or not you could reach conclusions based on the material that you're looking at. So with that, we'll conclude our study of the Beracha of Mishpat. My head is reeling. I hope your head is not. But thank you for your time and attention. B'ezrat Hashem, next week I will not be around. I will be away with my family, so I hope to return in 2 weeks, and we will discuss the next bracha, the much more exciting bracha of La Mishumadim. So looking forward to next time, everybody, and I'll see y'all next time. That's